Saturday, Rabbi.
I'll be there.
Yeah, if my head is okay, I'll come.
Well, we all have to be, careful of our heads.
Well, yeah, mine's been a little bit floaty lately, so I have to be careful.
I'll help you make it.
Thank you.
All right, it's good afternoon to everyone. It's so nice to see you all. Going to give it another minute or so to let the YouTube catch up and to let everyone else finish their login process. And then we will get down to our topic of the day, which, as you can see from the screen, is the afterlife. You'll just have to wait for the introduction, as you always know. Before I begin, I'd like to say a few words, as the old joke goes. There's always an introduction to the introduction. Nowadays, in most books, they simply call that the preface. Just a little bit longer, and then we'll reach our usual buffer time. Still trying to make allowances for people who are having technology problems, but want to make sure that people are able to get in the habit of showing up on time as well. Just had a quick question about whether or not Shabbat services are recorded, and the answer is yes and no. So the Shabbat services are recorded short term, meaning if you go to the Temple Israel website, tiflorida.org, and you go to the live streaming button, you will find through our Boxcast channel the archive of the last 2 or 3 months worth of services, which you can play at your leisure. It's the same way that you would watch a live version. However, after that, they are deleted. But I do cut out the sermons and upload those to YouTube roughly each week. Sometimes I get a little behind, so that people who want to just catch the sermon can do so. So if you want to catch a recent service, you can definitely go to our live streaming page and watch it in its totality. If you just want the sermon, go to my website, go to my YouTube channel. Just search for Joshua Neely on YouTube, and then you'll be able to see the sermons directly, alongside the copies of this particular class, the Pathway to Judaism class, my Mishnah class, my Lunch and Learn class, and any other special events or activities that I'm doing. We have been trying to record and upload as much as possible to make life easier during the last year, and that's something that we're going to continue even as we begin to get closer and closer to returning fully to normal, in order to just take advantage of the technology to make life and Judaism a little bit more accessible to people who may not be in danger of a pandemic, God willing, soon, but might still have just a bad week and not able to get into services. So yes, once again, we do live stream and have the recording. If anybody would like a copy of a recording, let me know, and I can actually download the entire recording, and then you can have it as your own private keepsake. It's something that we make available to families that have bar mitzvahs or weddings or other simchas. So if you want that, let me know, and I'll give you the link for a full download. I don't find too many people take me up on that offer. Most people like to have the current service rather than the previous ones. All right, I think we have definitely got our buffer in place, and that means we can get down to our topic at hand. So you may be wondering why it has taken us 20 classes to get to the topic of the afterlife. You may be familiar that in many other religions, the afterlife is almost square one. It is almost as though many religions will go from creation to the afterlife, with life being squeezed in between. That there was this thing called creation, people live, they die, and then we get to the important thing. Judaism does not quite look at the world with that angle. Now, contrary to some people's opinion, Judaism does have an understanding of the afterlife. We do have a concept of reward and punishment in the afterlife. However, please set aside any ideas you may have about that. Jettison anything you've learned from pop culture, from Western civilization, or just the average conversation about what happens when you die, because Judaism has a very different view, even though we often share the same words when talking about it in English. That can make it very confusing. So please start with a blank slate, do yourself a favor, drop any cultural baggage, and recognize that Judaism does not put the afterlife front and center, but it does have some very important things to teach about this topic. With that as a short introduction, let's get down to work. So, when we talk about the afterlife, there's one major problem. We've got no witnesses. When we talk about historical events, when we talk about cultural events, when we talk about legal events, we can read the rabbis who discussed it. We can read from the people who lived it. We can turn to people who have kept the cultural ideas alive. When we talk about the afterlife, well, no one's come back yet and given us a full, complete rundown. No one has handed us the tourist brochures from the afterlife. Instead, if you look through the Tanakh, if you look through the Bible, there is no clear, singular, well-articulated and laid out schematic of what happens after you die. If you look through the list of rabbinic writings, the Midrash, the Mishnah, the Talmud, there is no clear, laid out, perfectly understandable explanation of the afterlife. When you look through later rabbinic writings, post-Talmudic all the way up to the modern times, you will find among any writing of quality that there is much debate, discussion, and you might say hemming and hawing, as I'm doing here, as the outline takes shape, but the details remain fuzzy. In fact, the only place that you can find a clear, concise, incontrovertible explanation of what happens when you die is in books written by idiots, or more likely, books written by people who wish to prey upon the fear of us of what happens when we die and wish to give us some sort of marketable version that will push up their sales. The same thing, by the way, will nowadays drive social media, YouTube content, and otherwise. Anybody, though, who tells you this is what it is, I've cracked the code, is selling something or fooling themselves. They are definitely going to be fooling you. So please, do not be disappointed when you reach the end of our discussion this afternoon that you do not have all the answers to every aspect of what happens after we die. If you think you do, you're not paying attention. However, you will have a better understanding of the shape of what that life after this life will look like and why Judaism views it in the way it does, and more importantly for this class in particular, what that means for how we actually live. So, with that as my second introduction, let's get down to work. Why did the Torah, did the prophets, did the writings, did the rabbis, why didn't they spend so much time making this clear? It would have been easy after all. God knows exactly what the next world is like. God knows exactly what stages will happen. God has seen it all because God exists outside of time and space. Why didn't God just make an entire book of the Bible laying it out? 1045, Messiah comes, and so on and so forth. Well, to understand that, we have to understand the purpose of the Bible as a whole. Indeed, the purpose of the Brit, the covenant that God made. God gave us this covenant through the gift of Torah in order to connect to God in this world. God was not giving us the Torah and the covenant in order to gain entry into the next world. It does that, I should point out, but that wasn't the purpose of it. The same way that if your fellow gives you a pen, the purpose of it is to write. You may be able to use it to scratch behind your ear. It can also do that, but that isn't the reason you were given the pen. We were given the Torah to connect us to God in this world in ways which would improve our lives, our world, and our soul. And that is why the Torah does not spend a great deal of time emphasizing that. And indeed, if the Torah were to emphasize the afterlife more, if the Torah was to emphasize and explain and go into much more detail what comes next, it would detract from that message. It would make us more next world focused. It would make us less passionate about improving ourselves, our souls, and our world. And that would undermine the entire purpose of God's covenant with us, the entire purpose that God created the world. This world is not the lobby for the world to come. This is not a place where we just read magazines and bide our time. This is a world of work, of action, of life. And the Torah is focused on that. However, of course, it does give hints about the afterlife because it knows that this is an important topic and one that will draw much attention and speculation. And therefore, the Torah does want to give us some clues. However, as you can see from part 2 on this slide, the afterlife is a completely different form of existence. That's the bit of the misnomer. When we say life and afterlife, it sounds like party and after party. It sounds like they are somewhat comparable. Sounds like, sure, in part A, you do this, in part B, you do that, and it's of similar nature, of similar form, of similar feeling. There are some similarities because they sound like almost the same word. The next existence is not like this existence in the technical sense of existence. We do not have shape, we do not have time, we do not have material form. All of those things simply are not part of the next world, and therefore to explain it clearly is fundamentally impossible to a materially bound human mind. Instead, the text tries to lead us towards the understanding or feeling of the next world through the use of poetry and metaphor. Now, poetry and metaphor does the absolute best that is possible. After all, it has the best author possible, but it is still limited in our own capacity to understand. And that means the best we can hope for are glimpses and feelings of what the next existence will be like, and we are still going to be left with questions and uncertainty. That is just a limitation of both language as well as the human mind within this life. And there is really no way to overcome that 100%. If we could, we wouldn't be alive in this world in this way. We would be something else. And we're not. We are what we are. All right. So with that list of why this is going to be difficult to talk about and explain, and why the Torah and rest of Tanakh did not spend as much time to go over it, let's try and work out a little bit more about why we have the emphasis and then what the details look like. So, as I mentioned, the Torah wants us to focus on this world. But to understand fully exactly what that emphasis is like, I just want to take a quick story from the Talmud. Or not story, but textual discussion. For a day-old infant, they desecrate Shabbat. The Torah has said, desecrate for him a single Shabbat so that he may keep many Shabbatot. All right. Now, most of you, I'm sure, are wondering, well, why would you list a day-old infant as being somehow an extreme case? Unfortunately, in the ancient world, a day-old child was still considered to be not fully viable. Even a child that was carried full to term, once they were born and once they were exposed to all the dangerous diseases and other problems of life, and had not yet shown to the satisfaction of people in the ancient world that it would continue to thrive and live outside the mother, it was considered iffy whether or not that child would live. There were some, indeed some cultures, that would treat infants as though they were expendable. The famous stories of Sparta, that if a child was seen to be unlikely to be a strong Spartan, that the child was simply left out to die. They didn't consider that to be exactly murder because, you know what, children die all the time. Might as well focus our efforts on the good ones. Obviously, that is not a Jewish conception. All life is precious, and once the child has been born, it must be given every chance to live and thrive and take care of it. And indeed, even if that means breaking Shabbat on its behalf, we do so if it is necessary to keep that child alive and give it the best chance. On the other hand, for David, king of Israel, in death, they don't desecrate Shabbat. Once a person dies, the religious duties no longer take effect for him. That is in line with what Rabbi Yochanan said, free among the dead, his interpretation of Psalm 88. When a person dies, he is free of religious duties. So, two things we can learn from the example of David. One is that we do not prepare somebody for burial, nor do we conduct a burial on Shabbat, because why would we break Shabbat on behalf of somebody's body, given that the person itself is no longer there and there is no longer a chance for them to recover? But more deeply, we are learning that when a person is alive, their life is filled with the opportunity for mitzvot, here translated as religious duties. They are filled with the opportunity for spiritual growth and experience. And that is what we try to focus on in Judaism. Once a person dies, well, the chance, the opportunity, the time, all of the experiences that we had a chance to engage with, they are now gone. We move to a different set of experiences, don't get me wrong, but the unique moments of life, those will never come again. And so, while even a child that is iffy is alive, we move heaven and earth to help them. But once somebody has died, we treat their body with dignity, but otherwise we do not break Shabbat, for their journey in this world has ended, but our journey must still continue. Questions or comments? All right. Now, like I said, we do have a rough outline of what the afterlife is. And I'm using the term afterlife here as a full term for after the normal course of our own human history, the end of days, which is a bit of a misnomer, although it is used as an idiom. So we'll just use it as a general word. So we do have certain ideas about this afterlife, and that they're often mentioned in different ways, but in many different places. One, there will be some form of judgment. Two, there will be some form of reward and punishment based upon the judgment. And three, there is some form of continued life, some form of continued existence, substantially different than our own, that goes on after we have died in this world. So, with those three topics, let's see what some of that agreement tells us. So the first topic of judgment. We believe that God is the judge of all the world. This is clear throughout the entire Tanakh. There is almost no page where God appears that you are not reminded that God is the ultimate arbiter of what is right and what is wrong. We also know that all lives are expected to follow the laws of God. As we've talked about in passing in other places, there is a different set of laws for those that are not Jewish than those that are Jewish, but in one form or another, there is a set of expectations of what is right to be done and what is wrong to be avoided. So those that do not, meaning those that do not do what is right or do what is wrong, they are judged for having missed the mark. Right? God does pay attention to our actions. God does expect us to do what is right and to not do what is wrong. When we do something bad, that is noticed and marked as a mistake. And when we do something right, that too is noticed as being correct, and that therefore our lives are given a score, if you will. It's very important, although I don't have time to go into it today, to understand that unlike a test in your school, right and wrong answers do not balance out into a final grade, but each and every right and each and every wrong has its own moment of judgment and its own moment of a reward or punishment or rectification. I should also point out, although we'll talk about this in much more detail in the High Holiday section, that when a person is alive, there is much for them to do to take care of their mistakes. That our mistakes do not simply add up waiting until the end of our life, but instead our mistakes are something that can be addressed in the here and now, preferably in the moment after they are done, but as soon as possible once they are recognized. But that is something to be covered in much more detail when we talk about tshuva, about repentance, about returning our life to the proper balance. So since there is judgment, since there is the opportunity to know what is right and what is wrong, and expectation that we will do the right and avoid the wrong, then it is logical and fair that there be reward and punishment. Now, throughout the Tanakh, the main idea is that the good we do will lead to benefit in this life, and that the bad we do will lead to harm for ourselves and others in this life, and that the benefit and harm will outlive us as well. Very simple example, if I were to decide to blow up a nuclear reactor, that would be giving harm to myself, that would be giving harm to others, and the effects of that harm would continue for many, many years to come. Alternatively, if I were to dedicate my life to finding a cure for a disease, say, such as developing a vaccine for COVID, then that will bring benefit to me, because certainly I will benefit from having that cure as well, and it will bring benefit to others, and it will bring benefit long beyond my own lifespan. Indeed, this is the way that the world has continued to improve. However, the passages of the last chapter of Isaiah, as well as many other places, indicate that there is punishment and reward beyond this life as well. That there are ways for us to be rewarded and punished for our behavior in this world beyond this world. That the scales will be balanced to account for any leftover debts. Again, just as a very important reminder, Judaism believes that you can be both punished in this world, although one should never be quick to point the finger as saying, that is punishment for you, that is punishment for you, or even necessarily that it's punishment for myself. But punishment in this world can and does take place. Just simply do not rush to judgment upon others. That is not your place. But judgment can be avoided if a person fixes their behavior. Once done, then there is no punishment for that crime in the next part of our existence. However, if there are outstanding debts, there are crimes that a person committed for which they never repented nor repaid, then eventually the bill comes due. If not in this world, then in the world to come. Now, when we talk about punishment, many people's heads get filled with images of devils and demons and lakes of fire and all of the things from Dante's Inferno and all of the pictures of the Renaissance artists. Well, both Dante's Inferno and the Renaissance artists are great creators of art. They are lousy theologians when it comes to Judaism. Many people have this conception of hell as this place of physical pain and damnation. And in Judaism, we do not have quite the same conception. We do have a concept of something known as Gehenna or Gehinom, but it is not something that should be equated with the popular conception of hell. The valley of Hinnom, literally Gebehinom or Gehinom, which is where this comes from, was near Jerusalem, and it was used for the rites of Molech. Molech was a pagan god, often characterized by the burning of children, and you can find out more about this in 2 Chronicles 28 and 38 and 2 Kings 23. Because of this valley, the valley of Hinnom, being so synonymous with the terrible behavior of those who followed the pagan idol of Molech, the word itself, Gehinom or Gebehinom, became a byword, a stand-in for a terrible place of suffering. That does not mean that there is a literal terrible place of suffering in physical form or shape in any part of the world to come, but if you were talking to an ancient Israelite and you wanted to evoke the emotional feeling of, that's a terrible thing, using the phrase Gehinom would be a good way to emotionally trigger that reaction. The same way that if you wanted to talk about symbols of bravery, you might say Normandy, to remind ourselves of the bravery of the soldiers who went ashore at Normandy and across the the northern and southern coasts of Europe in order to liberate the continent. That doesn't mean that we are always talking literally only about that particular location. But if you said somebody had the bravery of the Normandy invaders, it can be used as a metaphor. Gehinnom was used as a metaphor of terrible, terrible place of suffering. So what kind of reward, what kind of punishment, and who gets what? Well, this is a little bit more complicated. So let us go ahead and look at the discussion that comes up in our text. So again, taken from the Talmud, and I apologize for the smallness of the text, but it's a long discussion. The house of Shammai, one of the great schools of thought of the ancient world, they say there will be three groups on the day of judgment, Yom Hadin, the day when the dead will rise: the thoroughly righteous, the thoroughly wicked, and the in-betweeners, meaning people who are 100% righteous and people who are 100% wicked, and all the rest of us, which is the vast majority of humanity. The thoroughly righteous immediately are inscribed and sealed for eternal life. It is very obvious. You are through the door, say Beit Shammai, and into the next world. The thoroughly wicked immediately are inscribed and sealed for Gehenna, as it is written from the book of Daniel, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to eternal life and some to shame and everlasting contempt. So Beit Shammai believed that if somebody was 100% wicked with no redeeming qualities, that indeed they would begin immediately their period of punishment. The in-betweeners go down to Gehenna, cry out, and rise, as it is written from the prophet Zechariah, and I will put this third into the fire and refine them as one refines silver and tests them as gold is tested. They will call on my name and I will answer them. And concerning this group, Hannah said from the book of Samuel, the Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. So by using the great song of Hannah, he is trying to use this as an explanation that yes, there is a going down, a time of punishment, but there is a rising up. So this is the opinion of Beit Shammai, which emphasizes the idea of a perfect and strict allocation of justice. If somebody is 100% good, then there's no need for any punishment of anything they've done. If somebody is 100% bad, then there's no need for any consideration. They begin their punishment without hesitation. If somebody is in between, then there's going to be a period where they need to be reconciled with that and create this sense of calling out. However, Beit Hillel, the house of Hillel, their rival academy, said, but God who abounds in mercy leans towards mercy. And concerning them, David said, I loved the Lord because he has heard my voice and my supplications. And concerning them, David stated the whole passage, Psalm 116, the Lord preserves the simple. When I was brought low, he saved me. Beit Hillel, according to the commentaries, is trying to say it's not so straightforward as saying punishment, 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 or rather no punishment and then punishment for everyone else. But instead, God will often lean towards the side of forgiveness and the side of mercy, and is not always going to immediately give the full measure of punishment for perhaps what we might deserve by a strict accounting. God is willing to overlook some of what we do in order that we be spared any unnecessary distress. Now, what form does that punishment take? Well, let's see another passage from the Talmud. Israelite wrongdoers and Gentile wrongdoers who follow their bodies go down to Gehenna and are judged there for 12 months. Now, before we get to this 12-month period and what happens during it, I just want to draw your attention to the idea that according to Jewish understanding, it is our physical nature that will often lead us to problems. Our soul is tahor, our soul is pure. And if it was left entirely to our soul, nobody would ever commit any wrongs, nobody would ever do any crimes, people would be fully enamored of God. Of course, there would also be no chance for transformation and growth. We would simply be locked as a static figure, much as an angel is. But because we are found in this material existence, we can deceive ourselves and we can be tempted and we can make mistakes. And as such, it's important to recognize then that the soul is always pure, even if it has been cluttered by mistakes, because that is its natural state. So it goes down to 12 months, says the Talmud, and after 12 months, their body is consumed, their soul is burned, and a wind scatters them under the feet of the righteous. Now, this is a metaphor, but it's based off the phrase in Malachi, and you shall tread down the wicked, for they shall be ashes beneath the soles of your feet. Oh, I have someone trying to get back in. Excuse me. But the sectarians, the informers and heretics, the many different groups that would try to attack the mainstream Judaism of the ancient world, who denied the Torah, who denied the resurrection of the dead, who separated themselves from the ways of the community, who tyrannized the land of the living, and who sinned and caused many others to sin, meaning these are all categories of the worst of the worst of the worst, such as Jeroboam, son of Nebat, and his associates. They go down to Gehenna and are judged there for generations, meaning they don't have a 12-month limit. As it says in Isaiah 66, and they shall go forth and look on the dead bodies of the men that have rebelled against me. For their worms shall not die, their fire shall not be quenched. So what the Talmud is trying to hint at here through the metaphor of Malachi and Isaiah is that we believe that there is a period, a limited period of punishment, even for what we would consider to be the general wrongdoers. There are some special categories that require more extensive punishment, that require more extensive repair, if you will, to allow their soul to be uncluttered from the terrible mistakes they made in life. Now, notice that in the list of those that are among the worst of the worst, we are not talking about mass murderers or others of that ilk that receive the harshest sentences in our civil society, and deservedly so. But instead, we are talking about those who have made the biggest mistakes spiritually and who have made the biggest mistakes that have affected others and their ability to be spiritually free. And that is why they are receiving this extended period of cleaning, of repairing all of their mistakes, because they have truly twisted themselves into a direction that is not just an act of passion or an act of psychopathy, but an act that is truly rebelling against the very nature of a good and merciful God. And thus, it takes longer to straighten out what they have made crooked. Questions or comments so far? I know this is still probably rather confusing. Like I said at the very beginning, that is to be expected. Now, even where some of these sources seem to indicate there is an eternal or long-lasting punishment, we have to remember other texts use time and Gehinnom as a way of emphasizing sin, murder, adultery, shaming somebody. This is often used as a hyperbolic statement, as a way of emphasizing these are terrible crimes. It does not mean that they were actually getting out a calendar and marking off the sentences for the different crimes that different souls might have committed. But it was a good way to drive home the sermon. Also, in Sanhedrin, meaning in the section of the Talmud called Sanhedrin, only very specific individuals are singled out for this punishment. And again, probably as a means of emphasizing the unique and terrible crimes that were committed by some of our worst kings, for example. And there is a difference between the notion of eternal punishment and failing to reach Olam Haba. Sometimes our texts will talk about the world to come as being a threshold to enter, and other times they talk about once you have entered, then the punishment, the reward, and other things continue. Again, it is not 100% clear what is meant to be understood as a literal step-by-step process, but the idea that those who are wicked will receive a proper, proportional, but limited punishment, and those who are righteous will also be punished for their mistakes, but will also receive a proper, proportional reward for any of the good that they did, is the overall theme that is clear from both the Tanakh as well as our traditional understanding of those passages. All right. So let's talk about life after death as we've moved through judgment, reward, and punishment. This has the most texts in Tanakh that provide clear support. However, it is not 100% clear what that life is going to be like, exactly how physical or how spiritual it will be, or whether it is purely spiritual. So some of the support texts come from places in Genesis. For example, this was the total span of Abraham's life, 175 years, and Abraham breathed his last, dying at a good ripe age, old and contented, and he was gathered to his kin. Now, this has to be understood metaphorically, because the first thing we learn about Abraham is that he is leaving the place of his ancestors, that unlike the rest of his family, he is going to be buried in the land of Canaan, eventually called the land of Israel, and not be gathered literally, physically to them. It's not like he could be buried in the same graveyard. So how could he be gathered to them? Well, he can be gathered to them in the world to come, in the next life. Similarly, these were the years of the life of Ishmael, the other son of Abraham, apart from Isaac, 137 years. Then he breathed his last and died and was gathered to his kin. We know that Ishmael was not buried at the cave of Machpelah in Hebron, and therefore we again have to interpret this as a metaphorical reunion of the souls of the departed, rather than just talking about their physical burial place. Likewise, when David is mourning for the child that he has lost in infancy, he says, "But now that he is dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me." Again, a clear understanding that there would be some reunion of themselves in the world to come. From Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes, "And the dust returns to the earth as it was, from which we were made, and the spirit returns to God who gave it." The idea that our spirit is going to continue beyond this existence and beyond our dust. Also in Samuel 2, Saul and Jonathan, the lovely and pleasant in the lives, even in their death, they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. They did actually die somewhat apart, and one might think that even if they had been dying precisely together and simultaneously, that nevertheless they are separated by death. No, says the poet here, instead they are still together because their bodies may have died, but their spirit continues. Now, moving from the biblical texts, the rabbis interpret these and the many other texts that are found throughout the prophets in a way that believes that there will be a period of physical life before the eternal spiritual life. Something like this, that there is a period of bodily resurrection at some point in the timeline of the end of days. Much debate about that timeline. Now, this is thought to be at some point after the Mashiach comes and the world has finally been perfected. This is mentioned repeatedly and stressed especially in the second prayer of the Amidah, which we recite 3 times each day, known as the Givurot, where God is called the one who gives life to the dead. And that phrase of giving life to the dead is an emphasis on the ultimate power and kindness of God, of allowing us to have an existence that stretches beyond the limited span we have here. So this was a very important point within Rabbinic Judaism and continues to be a very emphasized part as well. Now, exactly how that works, well, we're not sure. What we do know is that beyond that time, in the world to come, Olam Haba, as a non-physical life, our truly spiritual existence, which is eternal, there will not be a corporeal, a physical, a material substance. There are only the souls of the righteous without bodies. This is taken from the book of Rambam. Like the ministering angels, again, without physical form. The righteous attain to a knowledge and realization of truth concerning God to which they had not attained while they were in the murky and lowly body, meaning that our minds are finally able to fully and completely grasp and understand God, and through God understand everything, not only ourselves and each other, but all of existence. and that is, of course, in Rambam's estimation, the chief pleasure. Now, that can be metaphorized. That can be used turned into a metaphor of eating things that are pleasant, of drinking things that are fulfilling. But Rambam is trying to give us a different understanding of that. Oh, sorry. So that term Olam Haba, world to come, as you can see, is already causing a little bit of confusion. And that's because the phrase is used differently. For some writers, it can mean the world, meaning this world, after the Mashiach has come. This same time period can also be referred to by others as Gan Eden, meaning the Garden of Eden. But the term Olam Haba can also mean not this world, but heaven, meaning that fully spiritual existence without physical form. So what do we do with this word? We do the best we can. We use the term more generically, Olam Haba, to mean the different period of life once Mashiach has come, perhaps this world, perhaps the next world, depending upon context. Now, as an aside, I only have to talk about this because unfortunately many other people do, we need to discuss the topic of reincarnation. Now, some Jewish groups have begun in the last couple hundred years to talk about reincarnation. However, there is no mention of it in the Tanakh, in the Bible. There is no mention of reincarnation in any rabbinic writings prior to that period. And it doesn't actually fit logically and theologically within Judaism. We believe that a soul has one journey for which it will be judged, and that a body cannot be rewarded or punished for the previous actions of the soul in a different body. If I were to be suffering because of what my soul had done in a different body, made of different stuff at some different time in history, then that is simply not fair for this body. That's not the way suffering is going. All the more so when I have no recollection of what it is and therefore would suffer without understanding. Now, beyond the theology, the logic is even more problematic. And I do apologize to those of other faiths who may have stopped in to watch this. I will simply remind them that every faith is allowed to believe what they will believe. However, Judaism, and I believe logic in general, does have some certain problems with the concept of reincarnation. I still love everybody on earth, but logic has some trouble, right? More new souls would be needed each year as the population continues to rise. There are roughly 7 to 8 billion people now. There were 1 billion people at the beginning of the 20th century, more or less. That means that we have added 7 billion souls. That means the percentage of inexperienced souls, of new souls, would always be rising. Not everybody can be, the reincarnation of Cleopatra. Not everybody can be the reincarnation of famous people. In fact, even if you added up all the people who were before, they would not come close to being able to provide enough souls for those that are being born now and those who are currently alive. So there would simply be more and more new souls and fewer reincarnated souls, which would mean that the world would not be moving closer and closer to a time of perfection, but instead would be getting worse and worse as newer and newer souls who had never gone through the lessons were being born into new bodies. And in Judaism, at least logically, as animals are not judged for their actions, time spent in non-human form would be meaningless. What is the point of being reincarnated as a bear if while you are a bear, you cannot do right nor wrong, nor as the bear are you going to remember your human existence and feel the proper punishment or reward, perhaps, I don't know, maybe being a bear is nice, for that time that you are in the bear's body. It simply doesn't work. Now, there's a lot more to be said about this, but I did want to point it out only because, unfortunately, the concept of reincarnation has crept into some Hasidic and Kabbalistically influenced groups, but it is a foreign insertion. It's not uncommon for Judaism to pick up certain traits of host societies. Unfortunately, this one has become rather pernicious in some circles. But let's get to a topic that is a little bit clearer and one that is very, very important. It's very, very important because we hope and pray regarding the Mashiach, regarding the Messiah every day. It's very, very important because the topic of Messiah in particular has been used as a cudgel, as a weapon against us, especially by the historical Christian nations, which sought to discredit our concept of the Messiah and replace it with their own. Again, like I said, with regards to reincarnation, I am not saying that others should quickly abandon their faith, and I'm not trying to judge or impugn their faith. But as our faith has been attacked over the topic of what is a Messiah for about 2,000 years by, unfortunately, our Christian neighbors, I think it is important to point that history out and to point out precisely what we do believe about the Messiah, which you will then recognize is one of the preeminent reasons why we do not accept Jesus as having that role in any way, shape, or form. So, what does Judaism look for in a Messiah? So, taken from Rambam, who wrote the clearest example of this, which I will point out was then deleted in many European countries by the Christian censors. And so we are very grateful to those who lived in other parts of the world that were able to keep the text intact. This was considered to be so controversial by our neighbors that they could not even allow us to have it in our books. And they literally would edit it, delete it, cut it out of our copies. But the text persists because, well, truth will survive. Now, if a king should arise from the house of David, who is versed in Torah and engages in commandments, as did David his forefather, in accordance with both the written and oral Torahs, meaning if you have a king, and they're a good king, they are from the house of David, meaning that they are descended through their father's line from the house of David, then if they are a good and righteous person, following the commandments and doing what they should do, as we know in Judaism, both from the written and oral Torah, they should. And he enjoins, he makes sure that all of Israel follows in the ways and encourages them to repair its breaches, meaning that he helps them redouble their efforts to be good people themselves. And he fights the wars of God, meaning to defend the people, to defend Israel, to defend Torah, and to defend God. Then he may be presumed to be the Messiah, meaning if you are blessed to be living at a time where you have just such a person who is on the world stage and doing what is described here, then you can look at that person and say, you know what? This is a likely candidate for the Messiah. They are not called the Messiah yet. It is not done. It's not a slam dunk, but they are definitely in the running if they meet this minimum criteria. I should point out that we have had nobody in the last 2,000 years plus who has met the criteria so far. Even more when the next criteria is mentioned. If he succeeds in his efforts and defeats the enemies around and rebuilds the sanctuary in its proper place and gathers the dispersed of Israel, he is definitely the Messiah, which means the Mashiach is only truly, clearly the Messiah after they have finished the job. If somebody did all of the first half of that paragraph, but died before they brought peace, died before they had brought a resolution, died before the temple was rebuilt, died before we were regathered and reconnected to Torah and God, they were a good person. They were an amazing person, but they were not the Mashiach. They were not the Messiah. They were not the anointed, the literal term for that word, which of course is because none of those things came to pass during the life of Jesus or in the life of Bar Kokhba or in the life of Shabbatai Tzvi or any of the others who claimed to be the Messiah. Why we still wait for a Messiah. And it's also, of course, why we reject the concept of a two-part sequel Messiah. You come, you do the job, or you're not the Messiah. If you come, do it, and don't finish it, you're a great person, a helpful person, thank you very much, but you can join the ranks of other people who have helped contribute to the betterment of humanity and the betterment of Torah and God, but you do not get the title Messiah. Now, as Rambam says even more explicitly, from the safety of a Muslim country or across the Mediterranean from the main parts of Christianity at the time, the 11th century, But if he does not succeed in these matters or is killed, we know that he was not the one the Torah had promised. He is merely to be considered like all the other exemplary and qualified kings of the house of David who have died. Not that there were that many. God set him up only to try the masses, to test us. As it says, and some of the wise will stumble, to refine among them and purify, and to make white even the time of the end. For it is yet for the appointed time, meaning the right time hasn't come. Now, if a person supports these noble endeavors and then the person passes without completing the job, we shouldn't castigate them. We can say, look, you had a reason to believe if a person truly fulfilled all of those criteria, but you shouldn't be surprised that they have died. Indeed, everybody who has helped with this process before has died. It will take until the Messiah comes and finishes the job and then continues his human life, for the Messiah is considered to be a human. As we can see, they are born in a regular manner. Then we will know that we have reached that special moment. In the meantime, we hope and we work. Questions or comments on these criteria so far, before we get to what will it look like when the job is done? All right. So we continue. Nonetheless, the thoughts of the creator of the world are beyond any man's understanding. For our ways are not his ways, and our thoughts are not his thoughts. And all the doings of Jesus the Nazarene and that of the Ishmaelite, meaning Muhammad, who came after him, are nothing but to pave the way for the King Messiah and to prepare the entire world to worship God together. As it says from Zephaniah, for then I will turn to the peoples a pure language, that they may call upon the name of the Lord to serve him with one consent. So what Rambam is arguing here is that although it might confuse us that Christianity and Islam have risen and conquered so much of the world, we should understand that this may just be part of the way God is preparing the world to be able to receive the Messiah, that they are doing part of the job, albeit with far too much bloodshed and far too much oppression, of making the world recognize monotheism as the path of God. But we will wait and see how it will turn out in the end. So we are not to attack or to denigrate Islam or Christianity. We can recognize that they have their role to play in the process of bringing the world around. We can certainly criticize the actions of either faith or people acting in the name of those faiths that bring suffering and bloodshed, for surely that is not bringing the world closer to God. Said Samuel, however, when talking about what the days of the Messiah will be like, the only difference between this age and the days of the Messiah is Israel's subjugation to the kingdoms of the world alone. As it is said, for the poor shall never cease out of the land. So taking the terms of Deuteronomy 15 as his starting point, the Rabbi Samuel, not the prophet, is trying to teach us that we shouldn't expect the days of the Messiah to be days of miracles and days of wonders beyond changing the world's attitude, beyond changing the way people believe and act in the world. Now, that is wondrous and miraculous enough, but unfortunately, that is not usually what people put into the paintings or put into their depictions of the days of the Messiah. Instead, many people use all sorts of fanciful things. Rambam warns us, do not presume that in the Messianic age, any facet of the world's nature will change, or there will be innovations in the work of creation. God is not redoing the laws of nature during the days of the Messiah. Rather, the world will continue according to its pattern. There will still be sun, there will still be the moon, there will still be rain, there will still be clouds. This is how the world was built. The world will continue. It will still be a perfect world, but it will be a material world, which may still have some elements that you consider to be imperfect. However, you're saying, but what about all of those phrases that seem to tell us about wonders in the days of the Messiah? Although Isaiah 11:6 states, the wolf will dwell with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the young goat, these words are a metaphor and a parable. The interpretation of the prophecy is as follows, meaning if we unpack the metaphor, Israel will dwell securely together together with the wicked Gentiles who are likened to a wolf and a leopard, as is also the prophecy in Jeremiah. A wolf from the wilderness shall spoil them, and a leopard will stalk their cities. They will all return to the true faith and no longer steal or destroy. Rather, they will eat permitted food at peace with Israel, as Isaiah 11:7 states, the lion will eat straw like an ox. So what Rambam is trying to help us see is that the poetry of Isaiah and Jeremiah is a very good indication that the world is not going to fundamentally change. The animals are not going to behave differently in this particular case. Instead, the animals are representative of the different nations and peoples of the world. And in the days of the Messiah, they will no longer attack and prey upon each other the way animals do and will continue to do in the age of the Messiah, but instead the nations and peoples of the world will dwell together in peace. Just continuing on with this idea of what will it be like, there are some sages, again reminding ourselves that it is not 100% agreed upon, who say that Elijah's coming will precede the coming of the Mashiach. All these and similar matters cannot be definitely known by man until they occur, for these matters are undefined in the prophet's words, and even the wise men have no established tradition regarding these matters except their own interpretation. Therefore, there is a controversy among them regarding these matters, which Judaism is fine with. There are pages and pages and pages and books written about the many different opinions and debates, and it's okay that we do not have the timeline, that we do not have a precise hour by hour, minute by minute schedule for what the end of days will be like. That's okay. Like I said at the very beginning, that wasn't the reason God gave us the Torah or the rest of our teachings. God gave them for us to know in this world. That moment of final culmination, that will happen when it happens. And we don't really need to know it to know what I need to do today. What I need to do today, that was made clear by God. What will happen eventually, there was no reason to make it clear. Regardless, he goes on to say, of the debate concerning these questions, neither the order of the occurrence of these events or their precise detail are among the fundamental principles of the faith, as I've been saying since the beginning. A person should not occupy himself with the Agadot, these types of teachings, and the homiletics concerning these and similar matters, nor should he consider them as essentials, for study of them will neither bring fear or love of God. It's very important that in classical Jewish teaching, we do not try to encourage people to love God or fear God through the temptation of rewards or the threat of punishments. Although many other places around the world have often used both promises of gold and threats of violence as a way of trying to encourage people to connect with God in one way or another, Judaism has, as a rule, tried to avoid that type of emotion. Yes, some people will come to those conclusions and feelings on their own, and certainly it is better that than they are ignoring God altogether. But that is not why God gave us the Torah. It is not how we should focus ourselves. Rather, we should come to God out of awe and love through our understanding of God's commandments, not out of the wonders of threat and punishment. Similarly, this last part's very important, one should not try to determine the appointed time for Mashiach's coming. One should not sit around trying to calculate and come up with codes and cracking the secret and reading backwards and all of the other shenanigans that people have tried to do in order to establish a date. You will only lead yourself and others to disappointment if you try to do that. Instead, know that the day will eventually come, and in the meantime, there is plenty for us to do. And were the day to be tomorrow, or were the day to be 1,000 days from tomorrow, or 1,000 years from tomorrow, my job today doesn't change. My job today is always the same, to live a good life according to the Torah, to fulfill the covenant. Also, he finishes by saying, in that era, there will be neither famine or war, envy or competition for goodwill, Let me make sure I get the English right. There will be neither famine or war, envy or competition. For good will flow in abundance, and all the delights will be freely available as dust. He is trying to say that in the world to come, in the days of Mashiach itself, that this world will be a place of abundance and a place of good attitude and good feelings. Hopefully you understand that that is something that we can achieve even before the Mashiach comes. Yes, it may take the Mashiach to put us into the end, to bring us across that threshold, but we can end famine now. We can end war now. We can end envy and competition now, and all of the negative consequences that come from those very negative emotions. When the Mashiach comes, their end will be unavoidable, but we can at least improve, if not finish the job as best as possible right here and now. Again, this reemphasizes the idea in Judaism that we do not see our point of waiting for the end. We see our point as working towards this ultimate goal, which can be accomplished piece by piece by piece, act by act by act. That is our job. That is our focus. Enough said about the end of days. Questions or comments? I apologize for keeping you all just a little bit late today. All right, then we will finish for today. Take care, everyone, and be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.